Good to have everybody here this morning. We have several in our class here, and I know we've got several who are dispersed throughout the building in various Bible classes, so it's good to have you with us this morning. Those who are in the parking lot, those who are joining via the live stream, we're glad that you have taken out the time to devote to Bible study. Things look a little bit differently up here this morning. We lost Cody to the high school class a couple of weeks ago. We've lost Jim to a gospel meeting, and so we have picked up Whit, and looking forward to it.
Well, thank you. I was telling Berkeley I was teaching class this morning. She said, "Why are you teaching?" And I said, "Well, because Jim's at a meeting." So she said, "So you're going to pretend to be Jim this morning?" And I said, "I'll do what I can." But it's good to be with you this morning. It's interesting to be on this side of the auditorium.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're normally
you
kind
get
of
a
back corner. All right, Rock's telling me I need a microphone turned on. Am I good now? All right, glad I can be heard now. All right, well, yeah, you've got big shoes to fill this morning. But we've also got a lot to talk about, so we've got to move on pretty quickly. We're talking about the life of Jacob this morning. Some of that is, or all of that is not going to be discussed today because there are a few lessons towards the end of this study that kind of refocus on Jacob. But if you kind of know the Genesis narrative, we pick up on Jacob for a pretty long period of time. And then we drop Jacob. There's a lot of focus on Joseph, and then Jacob kind of comes back into the picture. So we're not going to talk so much about Jacob coming back into the picture at the very end. We're going to talk mostly about the bulk of his life. I told you the other day as you and I were discussing some of this, when we're thinking about the life of Jacob, there is a word that stands out to me, and the word is drama.
Yeah.
Because from the very beginning of his life, it is filled with drama. So we talked the other night in Jacob and Esau, his twin brother, even in the womb. Now Jacob probably didn't have much to do with that. I think most of the drama in his life, he had a hand in it, right? In the womb we'll give him a pass because he probably didn't know what he was doing. But there was a prophecy about his life when he was made in the womb, and they were already kind of at odds with one another. So before he was even born, he's coming into a life that is, maybe that's kind of a foreshadowing maybe of the drama that's going to kind of define his life. So really the first thing that we know outside of the womb, him and his mother are deceiving Isaac into giving him the blessing that really kind of belonged to Esau. We discussed some of that Wednesday night, but just kind of keeping in mind the life of Jacob, the very first story we know about him, there's conflict within him in the family. I want to just pause and ask a question right quick. Because this came up and I had thought about it, didn't mention it on Wednesday night. But when you think about Jacob and Esau in that episode where they are deceiving Isaac into the birthright, how many of you, just raise your hand if you think they were young men at that time? Like, okay, you don't have to be real timid. This is not like I'm not going to shame you if you get this wrong, okay? All right, so lots of hands going up. I have always thought the same thing, that when that episode was happening, these men were pretty young. But if we look later into the book of Genesis, it actually tells us some ages of Jacob that I think helps us. And just kind of quickly put this in your mind. You don't have to do the math right now. Research it on your own if you want to. But I think those Jacob and Esau were probably in their 70s at that time. Because the end of the book of Genesis gives us a couple of dates. For instance, Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. 91. Now, Joseph was born at the end of the 14 years that Joseph spent working for Laban. And so if you do 91 minus 14, quick math, I wrote it down.
77.
Yes. Yeah. I wrote it down to not get it wrong. 77 years old. And that seems to happen right after the conflict with Jacob and Esau. So, change that in your minds. If you had in your mind that they were young men, teenagers when that happened, or maybe slightly younger, I think they were probably in their 70s. So, moving on though, that was some drama in his life. Then he moves away because Esau threatens to kill him based on that story, and he moves away. And then as he meets a wife, there's immediately some deception that happens there. There's two wives that come into the picture, and we don't say a whole lot about polygamy, but the Bible never really sheds it in a good light because you see tension between Rachel and Leah. Jacob is kind of caught up in the middle of that. Then he has a daughter that is treated cruelly. We'll talk about that on Wednesday night, but his sons get involved there. There is this favoritism. Ironically, Jacob had some favoritism in the house he grew up in, and then he allows that favoritism to happen in his house that he's in charge of. He loses Joseph for a long period of time. There's a famine kind of at the end of his life. So drama seems to be the word that defines the life of Jacob. But let me ask you this, as we're just watching this long life unfold, and it's one event right after another, and there's always strife, there's always conflict, what in the world would we make out of that?
Well, I think you could take away several things from the story of Jacob. Number one, that God is working through men who make mistakes. Jesus obviously did not make mistakes. He was a perfect example. But throughout the Old Testament, especially with Jacob, I mean, think of all the things that went wrong in Jacob. And you just kind of gave us an overview of his life. But think about all of the things that Jacob did incorrectly. And think about the patience that God had with Jacob. And this is patience that a lot of times we read about in the New Testament, but is illustrated in the Old Testament. And to me, as a New Testament Christian, obviously living under the New Testament law, it's a comforting feeling to me to know that God does exhibit patience with us, and we can read about this patience very clearly in the life of Jacob. I guess I thought, and wrongly so, a lot of times growing up that, this promise God made to Abraham and then was passed on down was given to good men. And I'm not saying Jacob was a bad man. He was a good man, but he made his mistakes.
Right.
Just as we do today. God is still faithful to keep his promises, and that's comforting to me.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we could all take away from this Old Testament story. One of many is that we don't always have to be perfect, but we do have to be striving to do God's will.
Right. And ultimately, I think we see that in Jacob, although just like with Abraham, just like with Isaac, we see mistakes along the way, which again is comforting because we see mistakes in our own life. Even if we've been at this for a while, we recognize there are some real imperfections. Sometimes there's drama in my life, and maybe I'm kind of the cause of it. I wouldn't want to admit that much, but maybe we all can recognize that.
It also goes to show that how much God was dealing with.
Yes.
As far as on his plate.
Right.
Trying to connect the dots. And, this is a lot that God's going through as
well. Right. I think we talked about in the very beginning, Cody and I had a little bit of a discussion. Why does it take so long for us to get from the promises to Jesus? Because that's the promise we're really eager to see fulfilled. Why does it take so long? Well, for one, God is working through men. He's not pulling the strings, making everything happen. And because He's having to kind of wait on men, and because men sometimes take some diversions, I think that explains why it takes so long. But I really like that point that you made. When we see the patience of God talked about in the New Testament, how do we know that's true? It's true because we see it unfolding right here. When Peter says that God is not slack concerning His promises, but God is faithful. He's patient, not wanting any to perish, but He wants all men to come to salvation. I think that's rooted in passages or stories like Joseph, where God was clearly, or Jacob, I said Joseph, Jacob. God is clearly exhibiting patience, and I like that point that He didn't choose perfect men. He couldn't have chosen perfect men. So God is having to deal with men. But again, that's comforting. All right, so let's just go right quick through maybe a history of his life. And again, we're just painting the picture of it. We'll talk about some of these along the way. Some of this, again, was already talked about Wednesday night, because you can't talk about the early life of Jacob not talking about Esau. But here's how his life begins. Again, it's in the womb, and there's this prophecy. It's a strange prophecy to us because it says the older will serve the younger, and that's upside down. That's backwards. But again, what do we make out of that? I think the point Jim was making is that in hindsight, we see God's wisdom in choosing Jacob over Esau because of the way that their lives play out. So we see Jacob come into this world with maybe the odds are a little bit stacked against him. There's going to be some drama. And then we see this story where Esau sells his birthright to Jacob, and then moving on from that, we get to the story where in the birthright, Jacob and Rebekah deceive Isaac into blessing him. And that's another point. When we see that story, this is the family right now. God has made the promise to Abraham. It's made it from Abraham to Isaac, and now it's in the family of Isaac, and it's limited to Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Esau. And how many of them are good in that story? None. Isaac is trying to do something against what God had said. Jacob is deceiving, Rebekah is deceiving, and Esau's just not good overall. So imagine that. In God's plan of bringing the Messiah into the world, you have this episode where all of the people involved are bad. And so again, maybe we're just thinking again about the patience of God. And so Esau sells the birthright to Jacob. Later on, Jacob and Rebekah, his mother, deceive Isaac into blessing him, not Esau. Then Esau threatens the life of Jacob. He got so angry about being gypped, about what was rightfully his. He's so angry, he threatens to kill Jacob. And so Jacob's mom and dad do, I think, a wise thing. They said, Jacob, maybe it's best if you will get out of town for a little while. That takes us really about to Genesis chapter 28, where Jacob is sent away by his father. Notice chapter 28, verse 1. So Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and from there take yourself a wife from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May the Lord God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of people. So Isaac now seems to be kind of passing on something to Jacob, but that's really where we pick up with Jacob in what we haven't already covered. Jacob moves to find a wife. Now, before he actually gets to where he's going to find a wife, in chapter 28 and verse 10, Jacob stops along the way. And he came to a certain place. He spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and he put it under his head and he lay down in that place. And he had a dream. And behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. And the land on which you lie, I will give to you, to your descendants. He goes on to give him kind of a recall of the promises. Behold, I am with you. I'll keep you wherever you go. And I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you. Now, you told me when we started talking about angels, you really wanted to kind of elaborate on how angels work, how they work then, how they work today. You take as much time as you want.
That's my expertise, is angelic environments there. No, I do think that it's funny, though, that and you've got Jacob's dream where angels are descending the ladder. Later on, you're going to see, and I did not say that. I hope that you guys know that. But,
I thought you said that.
But you've got, when Jacob is wrestling here in a little bit with what turns out to be the angel, you've got angels appearing to Jacob later on, reminding him of a vow that he made. There were things, ministering spirits going on here in Jacob's life and others' lives as well,
right.
But not so much today.
Okay. That will be a discussion for another time, right? Yeah. They're definitely, if they're still doing something today, it's not quite the same as they're doing it. Because Jacob is very aware of some angelic presence and some communication coming to him. And I think that is important for you to point out. God does not always work in the same way. I think in the Old Testament we see the use of angels a lot, and the interaction was known. Jacob knows the interaction. Later on, he wrestles with an angel. He knows he's had this encounter or this communication with God. God may still be communicating or exercising some things in a certain way. We just wouldn't have any knowledge of it today, right?
No, I think you're right, and I think too, and I know we're not into the evaluation of Jacob's dream quite yet, but God doesn't speak to us through dreams either.
Right.
I mean, in these dreams, when we read about them in the Bible, they're all relating to the fulfillment of God's will.
Right.
If I came in here and I said, hey, I had a dream last night and God told me to come in here and tell you something different, y'all would think I was crazy, right?
Right,
But
yes.
a lot of folks today do put some value in dreams, and they try to keep a dream log or a dream journal, and they try to get these books and they try to evaluate these dreams. And it's just based on how many tacos you had the night before a lot of times, right? It has nothing bearing, no input on anything scriptural or anything that has to do with the way we're to live our lives. So I think that's one thing that some of the other, religious world do put a lot of stock into these dreams that we have, and that's something that obviously was, when we look at the dreams, was specific to the fulfillment of God's will. And
Right.
so just another thing, along with the angels, obviously we don't necessarily have angels that are coming to us in dreams and that are wrestling with us and things like that, but obviously there is perhaps a ministering spirit there that we could reserve for a later discussion.
Yeah, we can. Again, when you come with angels, or when angels come up, there are always more questions than there are answers.
Right.
I don't know is a pretty good answer sometimes when it comes to angels and what they're doing.
Right.
I will say this. I think you bring up an interesting point. I've never thought about this before. I've never thought about my dreams being related to tacos.
It's got to be something.
But it's got to be something,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so nonetheless, we understand what is actually happening here. I think the fact that angels are involved is just kind of a side note. What's really happening is God is communicating something to Jacob, and you mentioned this has a direct connection to the promises that have been made to him. Just continue reading. Jacob woke up. In verse 16 of chapter 28, surely the Lord is in this place and I did not know it. He was afraid and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Skipping down to verse 20, Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. Now, I think there may be something to this that has not really happened before. I think this is kind of an awakening moment for Jacob, perhaps. I want to point you back to something in chapter 27. In chapter 27, in verse 20, Isaac says to his son, how is it that you have said so quickly, my son? And Jacob answered, because the Lord your God. Do you see that? He calls the Lord Isaac's God. Isaac's God happened to me. And then in chapter 28, verse 13, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I'm the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I'm not sure, but I'm wondering if at this point, Jacob's faith was really his own faith. I think Jacob is just kind of going along with the plan, but it's not really, yes, this is my God yet. I think there may be something to that, because later on what we do see is him referring to God as his God. This was no longer the God of my father, the God of my grandfather. This is now my God. And I'm just wondering if this is kind of an awakening moment here in which God has shown him in this dream that there is a connection. I am with you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide for you, but you have to make me your God. And I'm wondering if that may not be partially associated with this dream. It's not just a reaffirming of the promises. It's not just instilling confidence in Jacob. It is this defining moment for him, perhaps, where he's going to own this, where God is going to be his God. And I think that's maybe an important thought for us today, especially as we are bringing up children, or maybe you're still a relatively young person yourself, where you have this time where maybe mom and dad brought you to church and you learned about spiritual things through your experiences as a child. But you and I right now, I think we're in a position, we're trying to bring up our children, as so many parents are. We're trying to bring up our children to know God and to love God and to serve God. But at some point, they can't just come to church anymore because that's what mom and dad do.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And I think it's interesting, I think your point is spot on, and I think it's interesting that this realization, I suppose, of his own faith came after some adversity was faced. And so I think as a dad, and as a parent, I think we all try to shelter our children as much as we can. And I think that's our job to do that. But at the same time, our children has got to face some adversity. they've got to have some discussions about why they believe what they believe, and they've got to have discussions of why they're here on a Sunday and on a Wednesday, and they've got to have some things that make them develop their own faith. So as much as we obviously want to keep them under our wing and keep them safe, and we should, we do still have to, I think, send them out into the world a little bit so that they can kind of get tested and face these adversities, just like Jacob's doing here, and make their faith their own. So I think sometimes it's hard to do because we don't want to do that, but you got to start jumping before you can fly, right? So in some situations, you've got to kind of put them out there to where they develop their own
there
faith.
may be defining moments in their life. I'm aware of a young lady who grew up in a tremendous family. She was in church all of her life. She was a good reputation, good conduct. Everything was lined up right. But she had been kind of sheltered, and I'm not saying that's wrong. I just say there's a time where they're going to be exposed to things that maybe their upbringing didn't expose them to. She got into college and started hearing a lot about evolution and fossil records and all of that, and she was forced to wrestle with it. Do I really believe this because it's true, or is it because mom and dad? And I think that was a helpful thing for her to go through, as much as it scares us to think that our children are going to get out in the world and they're going to be challenged. That challenge may very well be the thing that makes them make their faith their own, rather than a life of, this is where I go to church because this is where mom and dad brought me, and this is just kind of the thing that we do. So perhaps maybe that's going on with Jacob here. But I also think you're right. When it comes to our children, we've got to be having conversations about why, not just what. And I've heard some older people say, maybe my mom and dad, just didn't give good explanations. Well, why do I have to go to church on Sunday? Because I'm telling you, you have to go. And maybe when they're 3, we get away with that. But when they're a little older, maybe we need to start teaching them some things. So perhaps we see Jacob kind of coming into his own here, and that's a good thing. Now, we got to move on, because when we get to chapter 29, Jacob actually gets to where he's going. And he meets Laban, he sees the family, and now he is set on taking a daughter. And so chapter 29 kind of reveals the unfolding of that. Jacob meets Rachel, and Jacob likes Rachel. I don't know exactly what all it is about Rachel that he likes, but that's the one who he has his eyes on. And beautiful, verse 17, beautiful of form and face. And Jacob loved Rachel. So he makes this deal with Laban. For 7 years, for the younger daughter Rachel, I will labor for you. And Laban says, it's better that I give her to you than to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob and Laban, his future father-in-law, strike a deal. I'll work for her for 7 years. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. Is this the first romantic Bible story that we come to?
Would you work 7 years for your wife?
Absolutely.
I knew you would.
Yeah.
But would many? Would throw that out there to the world today. Would they work 7 years for the? I think they would probably say yes, but then on about year 2, I don't know if this is worth it.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
But yeah, I think it's got to be. I think it does show a very romantic love story here with Jacob, but it doesn't end that way.
Doesn't end that way. Let's talk about that in just a minute. So Jacob works 7 years. And his mind is kind of there, and it just seems as if this was only a few days because of the love that he had for her. But then Laban, the father-in-law, does something that just become almost unthinkable. There's a problem. There's a family custom, and the custom is the older daughter has to get married first. Jacob's 7 years, I guess, have kind of come to an end, and Leah still hasn't found somebody. So Laban comes up with this plan that we'll just kind of swap. And Jacob ends up with Leah in a mess. Mm-hmm. Leah, not Rachel. Yeah. Now, we could sit and talk for a while about how does he not know. I don't know the answers to that.
The research tells you that a lot of times the brides were covered.
Covered, yeah.
And really in one of those, where you just kind of see the eyes from what I can understand. So, but yeah, there's some questions that we have, obviously, that you would think, how do you not know? But we don't know.
But their dating customs were definitely
Right.
different than ours. I don't think they went to the movie theater together and sat across from the table from each
Right.
other at the Mexican restaurant and
Yeah.
stared into each other's eyes. He may not have really ever even seen her much
Sure.
throughout this 7 years. And so, you know, there's maybe a lot to be said. If he's older at this time, Isaac had poor eyesight. Maybe he's got poor eyesight. It was dark, so lots of fun things to speculate. But the real point is that he was deceived in this terrible way. Now, I'm assuming he had some choices. He could have said, you know what, I'm done, I'm going back. I'm not going to deal with somebody who's deceitful like that. But he doesn't do that. Now, you asked me the other day if he had the chance of the choice of divorcing.
Well, let's say that he did. And we don't know that necessarily that he did, but let's say that he did. And what a great example of sticking with your commitment.
Right.
He didn't even really make the commitment, but it was brought to him. Now he's married the wrong person. Mm-hmm. And you think about some of our friends who come to you and say, man, I just think I married the wrong person, or this person has changed, or this person is not the one that I married. But Jacob, you know, he could have said, hey, I'm out of here. Y'all take your livestock, your riches. I can't do this anymore. But he didn't. He stuck with his marriage vow, his covenant there, and made the best out of it.
Yeah. Not just the vow he had made with Rachel, but the vow that he had made with Laban. Now, he had fulfilled that. You could argue that. But Laban seems to take advantage of this. I think he liked having Jacob around. He later will say he recognized God is with Jacob, and anytime God is with somebody, it's good for me to kind of be alongside of them. I think there were some perks of having Jacob around. So he makes this deal, and he says, well, if you'll work another 7 years, then I'll give you Rachel. And maybe this just intensifies the romanticism here, because now he's willing to work another 7 years just to get the wife that he wants. So maybe there are some good things that we could say about the character of Jacob. He didn't just quit and run because it didn't work out quite the way that he wanted to. And again, I like that you're making parallels to our marriages today. While they're not started in the same way, and while the same things don't really happen to us and we got tricked into marrying, you do raise a good point that sometimes when we get into a relationship of any sort, or a commitment of any sort, a contract that we may enter into, when things don't go the way that we want them to, there is a tendency to just run. There's a tendency to quit. And so maybe we're seeing something here about the character of Jacob that says, this didn't really go the way that I planned.
Yeah.
However, I'm going to see this through. And I don't know that it was quite as terrible. I thought this at one time. I think you mentioned you thought this at one time. We kind of had in our minds, he's got to go another whole 7 years before he gets Rachel. But I don't think that's the case. I think he completes this, verse 27, complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also for the service which you shall serve me for another 7 years. So Laban allows him to actually get Rachel. It's just a week later, but then there's that commitment that goes on for another 7 years. And so Jacob did so, completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as a wife. Again, maybe Jacob is recognizing this is already a bad situation. Perhaps I can just kind of go along with it, and again, maybe some good lessons.
But we
there.
know the rest of the story.
Yeah.
We know about the 12 tribes and the kids, and maybe all of this was needed to happen.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But also, though, isn't it neat, ironic, neat, how Jacob and Rebekah deceived to get the birthright, and now Jacob is the one being deceived?
What do we call that?
Yeah.
What goes around comes around?
I think it's just that I think so. You know, and later on in Jacob's life with Joseph, he gets deceived with Joseph and thinking that Joseph was killed by this wild beast, and they bring him back the coat. So you know, we start off with this Jacob and Esau story about the birthright, and we focus on that and the deception. But Jacob kind of gets his just desserts on that later on in his life a couple of times.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it would be hard to know. We say karma sometimes, as if that's a very real thing, and you're going to eventually get what's coming to you. And that is true in some sense. We're studying the Proverbs right now, Jim, Cody, and myself, and it continually says kind of this idea that if you do this, eventually this will happen to you. So it's just kind of a known thing. But I don't think... I don't think it's something to overlook, that here were some things that he practiced in his life, and now he is seeing those things come to him. And so maybe later in life when we see some things kind of come back to us, maybe it makes us a little bit more sensitive to mistreating others later. So maybe there are some things that are happening for our good. Ultimately, these things maybe make him a little bit more sympathetic. And I think we'll see that when he gets this opportunity to be reconciled with Esau. Maybe some of this is kind of coming back. We'll talk about that in just a minute. We don't have time to talk a lot about all of the children coming into place here, but that's the next thing that happens into his life. He doesn't have one wife, but he has two. And I mentioned earlier, when you have two wives into the equation, that makes a little bit difficult, and here that is emphasized in the fact that Rachel is not able to have children. Now that was a really big thing for them back there. Her value as a wife, I think, was determined by, can I give my husband children? And so we almost see this kind of competition coming in. Chapter 30 and verse 1 says, now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, give me children or else I die. Talk about drama. You kind of see it in that statement right there. If you can't give me children, life is over, right? And so we see that happening here. Now Jacob kind of barks back at her in angry, burned against her. And he says, am I in the place of God? In other words, you think you're barren because of something that I'm controlling. I'm not doing that. And so verse 3, we see another practice that we saw with Abraham. Apparently this was a fairly common practice. Here's the wife. The handmaid is at her disposal, and so she would kind of come in, just like we saw with Abraham and Sarah. They were trying to kind of speed up God's plans. We don't have a child. Here's my handmaid Hagar. You go have a child with her. Of course, that didn't work with God, and God later clarified that for them. But here's what we see happening. Here we see some children being born by the handmaid. And of course, Leah is having children all along the way. And then eventually Rachel is able to have, verse 22, God remembered Rachel and gave heed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. She named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give me another son. So now Joseph will later be the favorite. And I don't know if we know this for sure why he's the favorite, but Rachel was the favorite wife, and this was the firstborn son of the favorite wife. Is it possible that's where some favoritism towards Joseph started? Possible, right?
Maybe.
Okay, it had to start somewhere, so let's speculate and say that it maybe started here. But overall, and again, there's a lot to be said, but you mentioned the significance of the sons that are being born here. There's a daughter that's born here. We'll talk about her in chapter 34 on Wednesday night. But the significance, these are the sons. And so now God has determined it was going to be started with Abraham. Isaac will continue it on. Now we get to Jacob, and from Jacob, this family's really going to branch out. Jacob has 12 sons, and we begin to understand the significance of those sons a little bit later on. But this is how God's going to allow Abraham's family to really start growing into that great nation. This is kind of the beginning of that. And so there are the children that come into play. We've got to move on thinking about now he's ready to leave Laban, and he's coming back to Canaan. And in chapter 30, the end of chapter 30, we get this strange story where Laban and Jacob kind of strike this deal, and Jacob is going to make this deal with him about the different speckled and the spotted livestock. And I think all we really have time to say about that is Jacob is making a deal with Laban which seems to be in Laban's favor. And of course we know the nature of Laban. If he thinks I've got the upper hand, I'm going to take this deal. But then there's something strange that comes. Verse 37, Jacob is able to kind of manipulate the flocks in some way. He takes fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white stripes in them, exposing the white which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks, the gutters, even in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, and they mated when they came to drink. And so the flocks mated by the rods and brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And that's going to turn into a favor for Jacob. Now, is there any part of you that thinks if you had livestock today and you took rods of poplar and almond and plane trees, expose those, and let the livestock mate in front of those, that you're going to be able to dictate what they look like? I don't think so. So obviously, God is at work here. Now, Jacob, how he knows to do this, I don't know. But we're talking about, again, a life kind of full of difficulties. Laban is providing some real difficulty in the life of Jacob right now. Isn't it a good time to hear from God again, coming in saying, trust me, I'm with you?
Well, it's just another example of God taking care of Jacob.
That's right. And remember what Jacob said at the end of verse 28? After that appearance, the ladders, the angels, and I return to my father's house in safety. If God will take care of me, and if I return in safety, well, Jacob is on his way back now. And I think what God is showing is that he is still taking care of Jacob. So we've got him going back. Of course, Laban kind of pursues them. But again, Jacob ultimately recognizes, notice chapter 32 and verse 10, he recognized, I am unworthy of all the loving kindness and all the faithfulness which you have shown to your servant. Here is Jacob calling himself the servant of God. For with my staff only I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two companies. So he is on his way back to meet Esau. He's on his way back to Canaan, and he stops and he recognizes God has been really good with me. It was a while before this. I was leaving because my brother Esau was going to kill me. I didn't have anything. Now I've got everything. And so we see maybe the maturity of Jacob here as he goes back to Canaan. Now we get into chapter 33. And he is going to, chapter 32 and verse 6. The messengers have returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau, and furthermore, he's coming to meet you, and he has 400 men are with him. Now, what does Jacob hear?
It's on.
It's on.
He's coming to get me, right?
Right.
All these years have passed. He's been angry. This anger has been kindled. He's coming after me.
Yeah.
Which you've got to think Jacob's been thinking about for however long this has been.
At least 15 years, right? Yeah.
So you know it's always been in the back of his mind. So yeah, whenever you hear Esau's coming with his guys, it's time to take care of the women and kids and let's get ready for battle.
Right, because the last thing he remembers Esau saying is, you're a dead man. Right. And so you can understand. I don't know if there's something to be said here about it. It would be hard to make much out of it. But I think sometimes we have that same tendency. We hear something, we assume the worst. Yeah. And that maybe is okay sometimes. Maybe sometimes it messes with us a little bit. But Jacob kind of gets all psyched out about this, and we kind of understand that. Now, we get to chapter 32, verse 24, and we have another angel coming in here. And this time there is a wrestling. And it seems to go through the night, and I don't know what we would make of all of this, except for it's another encounter with God. And, you know, someone wrote that you kind of have this paradox with humans, and that how it's kind of summed up in this. On one hand, God is kind of leading Jacob into a difficulty here, yet God is also going to take care of him. Perhaps that's a lesson that's meant here. I don't know. What
well, you
thoughts?
know, if nothing else out of the wrestling with God, verse 28, Jacob gets a new name.
Yeah.
His name is changed to Israel at that point, and perhaps there was some significance in that as far as the wrestling and things of that nature. I don't know. That's as far as I could tell you.
Yeah. All right. Your knowledge of angels has really
disappointed you.
You set me up thinking I can tell you everything about this.
Well,
this is one of the stranger stories in the Bible, though, right?
Just more drama for Jacob.
It is more drama for Jacob. And again, other things have been speculated about this, how his whole life has kind of been filled with this strife. Now he's in this strife kind of with God. And Jacob sees, I'm not going to win this one, right? And he gets his hip disjointed and it doesn't seem to come out. So maybe God is allowing him to see something about this. Again, I don't know exactly what we would make out of all of that. But Jacob, again, comes out, I think, from this encounter, he comes out in a better place, maybe better prepared to go on and do what God is wanting him to do. And so then we get to chapter 33. And when we get to chapter 33, I think we mentioned this probably on Wednesday night. This does not happen for sure the way that Jacob wanted or expected it to, because Esau embraces him. Now, Jacob also has this really awesome gift planned for him. He just has a tremendous amount of things prepared. Flocks, gifts that he's going to give to Esau, because in his mind, Esau is angry. I'm going to try to make it better. And that's really the way that you would settle a dispute, right? If somebody's mad at me, the best thing I can do is buy him a present.
Like my wife.
If that works, then you do that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so if you make her mad, buy her something, and that eases it. I think Jacob is thinking, I'm going to flood him with these gifts, and that's going to kind of make him forget about it. Now, Esau says, I really have all that I need. So here's my question, and we'll kind of have to end with this, I guess. We'll definitely have to end with this.
We've got 5 more minutes. Right?
Okay, they'll listen for a minute. I know
it's a long story.
Yeah. So, do you think in some way Jacob is trying to repay what he scammed Esau out of in the beginning?
Maybe. Either that or he's trying to appease his wrath a little bit.
Or both.
You know?
Like, hey, this will kind of help me make up for what I stole from him in the past, and this will also appease his wrath at the same time.
But isn't this, though, I guess this is where we end today, isn't this a great story, though, as far as how two brothers who were at odds with one another over something really serious were able to come together and seek forgiveness? And
yes.
You know, I think there's a lot of drama, is the name of the word of the day, a lot of drama in families today. And I just wonder sometimes, do we do enough to rectify situations in our families like Jacob and Esau did? And the courage, whatever you want to say about Esau, and we know about Esau later on in life, and it doesn't seem like he was a good man, and descendants weren't very good, but he had the willingness and the courage. It says that in verse 4 that Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, and just what a great story that is.
Yeah, I wish we knew more about Esau from this point on. Now, we know what happens to the lineage of Esau. They're going to conflict with God's people regularly. I do wish we knew more about Esau, because I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, because the last thing I see him do in the historical record is he does a really good thing. And I think that's a good point that you make, that sometimes somebody does something to us and we think, I'll never be able to forgive them for that.
Well, Esau wanted to kill him.
Well, yeah. He's changed a lot, right?
Yeah, and I think,
and that says something about how a person can change over time. So maybe that's good. All right, thank you for your attention. Hopefully this has been helpful, just kind of drawing out some things that we learned from this long record of his life. Jim, Lord willing, will be back on Wednesday night, so you'll be off the hook talking about chapter 34. It's a little bit of a strange chapter that actually happens with a daughter, and Jacob's sons are involved. So go ahead in preparation for Wednesday night. Take a look at chapter 34. Again, if you have questions, we haven't said this in a while, but if you are reading this between now and Wednesday, if you have some questions about something you see in the text, just email it to me or Jim, text, or just let us know